A billionaire insists his black may perform for his friends, mocking her. Her song, however, brings a hidden family secret to light, leaving the guests in shock and altering their perception of her. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Richard Lawson stood at the top of his marble staircase, surveying the crowd of New York's elite that filled his mansion's grand ballroom. Crystal champagne flutes clinked as hedge fund managers and real estate moguls exchanged stories about their latest acquisitions. The chandelier's light caught the diamonds and precious stones adorning the necks and wrists of their wives, creating a constellation of wealth below him. And then I told the board, Richard announced to the small group gathered around him, either accept my offer or watch their company crumble. He laughed, his voice carrying across the room. They signed the papers the next day. His audience responded with appreciative chuckles, their faces eager to stay in his good graces. Richard thrived on these moments, where his power was on full display. In the kitchen, away from the opulent display of wealth, Lila Martinez wiped her hands on her black uniform apron. The sounds of the party filtered through the service door. Fake laughter, exaggerated stories, and the occasional condescending comment about the help. She had been working in Richard's household for 3 years, managing to stay largely invisible despite her striking features and the graceful way she carried herself. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she arranged another tray of hors d'oeuvres. The weight of her grandmother's pendant pressed against her chest beneath her uniform, a reminder of who she was beyond these walls. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, teaching her the songs that had been passed down through generations, songs of struggle, resistance, and hope. The kitchen door swung open suddenly, and Richard Lawson strode in, already speaking before he fully entered the room. Lila, I hear you're quite the singer. His voice carried that familiar tone of entitlement, the one that suggested resistance was futile. Several guests trailed behind him, their curious eyes fixed on Lila like she was an exotic specimen in a museum. Mr. Lawson, I'm in the middle of preparing dash, Lila began, but Richard cut her off with a wave of his hand. These people paid good money to attend my charity gala, he said, though Lila knew the event was more about tax breaks than actual charity. The entertainment I hired canceled last minute, and I heard from my housekeeper that you used to perform in churches. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Consider this your chance to shine. The guests behind him whispered among themselves. Lila caught fragments of their conversation. The maid? How unusual. Richard always did have a flair for the unexpected. Some looked uncomfortable, others amused, but none spoke up in her defense. Richard's hand found its way to her shoulder, steering her toward the ballroom. Come now, don't be shy. Show these good people what you can do. His grip was firm, brooking no argument. Unless, of course, you're not as talented as Maria claims you are. Lila straightened her spine, her grandmother's teachings about dignity in the face of humiliation surfacing in her mind. The pendant seemed to grow warmer against her skin. She could refuse, risk her job, and walk away with her pride intact. Or she could take this moment, this stage he meant as a form of mockery, and transform it into something else entirely. Several of the guests had gathered near the entrance to the kitchen, creating an impromptu audience for Richard's power play. Their expressions ranged from mild interest to obvious discomfort, but none intervened. This was Richard Lawson's show, as everything in this house was Richard Lawson's show. Very well, Mr. Lawson, Lila said, her voice steady despite the anger and humiliation burning in her chest. I would be happy to sing for your guests. She removed her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter. Every movement was deliberate, a small act of defiance in its precision and grace. The murmurs among the guests grew louder as Richard guided her toward the ballroom's makeshift stage. Some guests quickly moved aside, as if her proximity might somehow taint their designer clothes. Others watched with the detached interest of people observing a social experiment unfold. Richard's triumph was evident in his posture as he led her through his mansion, past priceless artwork and antiques that probably cost more than what she earned in a year. He was putting on a show, demonstrating his power over everyone in his domain, from the wealthy guests who sought his favor to the servants who depended on his employment. The ballroom fell into an expectant hush as Lila took her position at the front of the room. The space wasn't designed for performances. It was meant for Richard's displays of wealth, from the Italian marble floors to the Renaissance paintings that lined the walls. Standing there in her black uniform, Lila looked distinctly out of place among the evening gowns and tuxedos. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the way her grandmother would sing this song in their small kitchen, the melody carrying stories that weren't written in any history books. The pendant against her chest seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. When she opened her eyes again, she didn't see Richard's smirking face or the condescending looks from his guests. Instead, she saw an opportunity. The first notes left her lips softly, almost tentatively. It was an old spiritual, one that spoke of rivers and freedom, of chains broken and spirits unbound. The words were in English, but the rhythm, the soul of it, came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing this wasn't the entertainment they had expected. The song built slowly, like a wave gathering strength. Lila's voice, trained in church choirs and perfected during late nights when the mansion was empty, filled every corner of the vast room. The crystal glasses on the refreshment table seemed to vibrate with each note. The forced laughter and artificial conversations died away, replaced by an unexpected silence. Richard's expression began to change. The smug smile that had played on his lips when he'd forced her to perform started to falter. Something in the melody seemed to reach past his carefully constructed walls of privilege and power. His hands, which had been casually holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, tightened around the glass. The song spoke of pain, of separation, of mothers torn from children and families ripped apart. But it also spoke of survival, of strength passed down through generations, of hope that refused to die even in the darkest times. Each verse built upon the last, creating a tapestry of sound that was impossible to ignore. Several of the older guests appeared visibly affected. An elderly woman in the corner dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A distinguished-looking man with silver hair stared intently at the floor, his jaw clenched. The younger crowd, usually so quick to return to their phones or private conversations, stood transfixed. Richard felt something stir in his memory. His grandmother had told him stories he'd dismissed as relics of a past best forgotten. But now, with Lila's voice filling his home, those memories began to surface. He remembered sitting in his grandmother's study as she spoke of family secrets, of debts unpaid and wrongs never righted. The song reached a crescendo, Lila's voice soaring above the stunned silence of the room. The lyrics spoke of judgment, of a day when all accounts would be settled, when the mighty would be brought low and the humble raised up. The words seemed to show off the expensive artwork and imported furniture, turning Richard's symbols of wealth into witnesses of this unexpected moment. Some of the guests began to recognize the deeper meaning behind the performance. This wasn't just entertainment, it was testimony. Each note carried centuries of history, of struggle, of resilience. The young socialite who had been documenting the party on her phone slowly lowered it, her carefully made-up face showing signs of genuine emotion for the first time that evening. Richard found himself unable to move, unable to interrupt or end the performance as he might have planned. The scotch in his glass remained untouched, his usual shield of alcohol and arrogance proving ineffective against the raw power of Lila's voice. Memories continued to surface, his grandmother's face, serious and sad, telling him about their family's role in events he'd preferred not to acknowledge. The room's atmosphere had transformed entirely. The superficial glamour of the party had been stripped away, replaced by something more profound and uncomfortable. The designer clothes and expensive jewelry suddenly seemed like cheap costumes. Inadequate protection against the truth Lila's song was laying bare. The final notes of the song hung in the air like a challenge. Lila stood straight and proud, her eyes now open and meeting the gazes of those around her. She was no longer the invisible servant. She had become a channel for something larger than herself, a voice for stories that had been deliberately forgotten or ignored. In that moment of silence that followed, before anyone could react, before the spell could be broken by nervous laughter or dismissive comments, the truth of what had just happened settled over the room like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just a performance. It was a reckoning, and everyone present knew it. Sarah Whitney stood near the back of the ballroom, her champagne flute untouched in her hand. Unlike the other guests, she hadn't come for the social prestige or business connections. As the head of a prominent civil rights foundation, she'd attended Richard's parties over the years to secure donations, playing the careful game of appeasing the wealthy while trying to maintain her principles. But watching Lila's forced performance had crossed a line she couldn't ignore. Sarah recognized the subtle violence in Richard's actions, the way he'd used his power to put Lila on display, treating her dignity as something he could dismiss for his entertainment. The scene reminded her of stories her mother had told her about society parties in the 1960s, where wealthy whites would occasionally showcase their black employees, a practice that was no less demeaning for being framed as appreciation. The tight grip Sarah maintained on her champagne glass matched the tension in her jaw. She had known Richard since their college days at Yale, watched him build his fortune, and seen how that wealth had gradually stripped away whatever empathy he might have once possessed. Their friendship had become increasingly strained as his attitudes calcified into something ugly and entitled. As Lila continued to sing, Sarah observed the reactions around her. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, perhaps feeling the first pangs of conscience. Others maintained their practiced expressions of polite interest, the same looks they wore at charity auctions and benefit galas. A few seemed genuinely moved, though Sarah wondered if they would remember this feeling tomorrow, or if it would fade like morning mist under the harsh sun of privilege. Her own family history weighed heavily on her mind. The Whitneys had been civil rights supporters since the 1950s, but Sarah knew that support had often come with its own form of condescension. Her grandfather's generation had viewed themselves as benevolent helpers rather than allies in a struggle for justice. It had taken years for her to understand the difference, to recognize that TRUE advocacy meant confronting uncomfortable truths about power and privilege. Looking at Richard now, Sarah saw more than just her old friend's arrogance. She saw the culmination of generations of unchecked privilege, the end result of a system that allowed people to believe their wealth made them superior. The way he stood there, watching Lila perform, reminded Sarah of historical photographs she'd seen in museums. Images of plantation owners showing off their happy workers to visitors. The decision crystallized in her mind with the clarity of cut diamond. She had spent too many years being diplomatic, choosing her words carefully to avoid offending potential donors. But watching Lila stand there, singing with dignity despite the humiliation Richard had intended, Sarah knew it was time to speak plainly. She set her champagne glass down on a nearby table with deliberate care. Several guests nearby noticed her movement, perhaps sensing the shift in her usually careful demeanor. Sarah had built her reputation on being diplomatic, on knowing how to navigate the delicate sensibilities of the wealthy. Tonight, that reputation would have to take a back seat to something more important. Sarah began moving through the crowd, her purpose evident in every step. A few people tried to catch her attention, a bank executive wanting to discuss a foundation grant, a society matron eager to show off her latest charitable initiative. She acknowledged them with brief nods, but didn't stop. Her focus remained on Richard, who stood near the makeshift stage, still watching Lila with an expression that mixed confusion and discomfort. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. She knew that confronting Richard here, in his own home, during one of his carefully orchestrated displays of wealth and power, could have consequences. He was vindictive when challenged, and her foundation relied partly on donations from people in this very room. But watching Lila sing, seeing the raw truth in her performance, Sarah understood that silence in the face of such casual cruelty made her complicit. As she approached Richard, Sarah mentally prepared herself for the conversation to come. She would need to be direct but strategic, harsh but not alienating. The goal wasn't just to shame him. That would only make him defensive and resistant to change. She needed to make him see, really see, what he had done and what it represented. The final notes of Lila's song were fading away as Sarah reached Richard's side. The room hung in that delicate moment between performance and response, when truth could slip through the cracks of social convention. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what needed to be said. The time for careful diplomacy was over. Richard, Sarah's voice cut through the lingering silence that followed Lila's performance. She kept her tone low, meant only for him, though several nearby guests turned their heads with poorly concealed interest. We need to talk about what you just did. Richard's face shifted from discomfort back to its usual mask of confident authority. Sarah, always the crusader. He attempted a dismissive laugh, but it came out forced. I gave her an opportunity to showcase her talent. Most servants would be grateful for such exposure. Servants? Sarah's voice hardened. Listen to yourself. Do you even hear how you sound? She moved closer, forcing him to step away from the small crowd that had gathered around him. The crystal chandelier above cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the defensiveness in his expression. You're overreacting, Richard said, taking a sip from his scotch. This is my house, these are my guests, and Lila is my employee. I can ask her to perform if I wish. His words carried the practiced certainty of someone used to having his actions questioned. Sarah glanced at Lila, who stood quietly near the piano, her face composed but her hands clasped tightly together. She's not a possession, Richard. She's a human being with dignity and talent that deserves respect, not exploitation for your entertainment. The nearby conversations hushed as guests pretended not to listen while straining to hear every word. Richard noticed the attention and straightened his spine, adjusting his tie. I pay her well, better than most. She has health insurance, vacation days - stop. Sarah cut him off. This isn't about her compensation. This is about you parading her out like some sort of exhibition. Did you even ask her if she wanted to perform? Or did you just assume your money gave you the right to command her? Richard's jaw tightened. I don't need to justify my actions to you, Sarah. You've been spending too much time with your foundation's radical ideas about privilege and power dynamics. He tried to turn away, but Sarah stepped into his path. Those radical ideas are basic human decency, Richard. What you did tonight, it's not just about Lila. It's about a pattern of behavior, about how you view people who work for you, about how you treat anyone you consider beneath your station. The alcohol in Richard's system began to show in the slight flush of his face. Beneath my station? I built everything I have from nothing. My father may have had money, but I turned it into an empire. I earned my position. Did you? Sarah's question hung in the air. Or did you inherit more than just money? Did you inherit assumptions about your right to control others? About your superiority? She gestured toward Lila. That song she sang. Did you even listen to the words? Richard's expression flickered, revealing a moment of uncertainty. The song had stirred something in him, memories he'd pushed aside. It was just a spiritual Sarah, an old song. It was history, Richard. Your history. Our history. The history of power and oppression that we're still living out in new ways. Sarah's voice softened slightly, seeing the crack in his armor. You're not a bad person, Richard, but you're perpetuating bad systems without even realizing it. The room around them had grown quieter, the usual buzz of party conversation dimming as more guests turned their attention to the unfolding drama. Richard noticed the eyes on him, the judging looks from people who usually sought his approval. This isn't the place for this discussion, he muttered, trying to maintain his composure. You're making a scene. No, Richard. You made the scene when you decided to treat Lila like entertainment rather than a person. Sarah stood her ground. The question is, what are you going to do now? How are you going to make this right? Richard's hand tightened around his glass. The scotch caught the light, amber waves reflecting his distorted expression. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in years, he looked uncertain about his position. What would you have me do? His question came out almost like a challenge, but Sarah heard the genuine confusion beneath it. Apologize? Write a check to your foundation? What's the proper penance for offending your sensibilities? This isn't about my sensibilities, Sarah replied. It's about recognizing patterns of behavior that need to change. It's about understanding that your position comes with responsibilities beyond just writing checks. Lila's voice rose again, cutting through Sarah and Richard's confrontation. She had begun another song, this one even more powerful than the last. The melody carried centuries of defiance wrapped in haunting beauty, and the lyrics spoke of freedom. Not just physical freedom, but the liberation of the spirit. The entire room fell silent as the song reached its crescendo. Lila's eyes, which had been closed during most of her performance, opened now and fixed directly on Richard. There was no submission in her gaze, no trace of the deferential employee. Instead, she stood straight-backed and proud, each note a declaration of her humanity. When my grandmama sang this song, Lila's voice carried between verses, strong and clear. She wasn't asking for permission to be free. She was announcing it. The words hung in the air like a challenge, transforming what Richard had intended as entertainment into something far more potent. The wealthy guests, who moments ago had been whispering about the confrontation between Sarah and Richard, now stood transfixed. A prominent judge near the front had tears running down his cheeks. An elderly socialite who had earlier complained about the help being too familiar was clutching her pearl necklace, her expression a mixture of shame and recognition. Richard couldn't look away from Lila's steady gaze. The scotch in his hand trembled slightly, causing the ice cubes to clink against the crystal. The sound seemed to echo his own internal disturbance. This wasn't the submissive performance he had expected when he commanded her to sing. Instead, it was an indictment. The final verse of the song spoke of reckoning. Not a violent overthrow, but the quiet, unstoppable force of truth finally being acknowledged. Lila's voice soared through the high notes, filling every corner of the mansion with sound. The chandeliers seemed to vibrate in response, casting dancing shadows across the gathered faces. As her voice rose for the final notes, several guests began to weep openly. A young venture capitalist who had earlier been bragging about his latest hostile takeover now stared at his shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The atmosphere in the room had transformed from one of privileged entertainment to something approaching a collective moment of conscience. The last note hung in the air like a verdict. Lila didn't bow or curtsy as performers often did at these events. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her grandmother's pendant catching the light. The silence that followed was absolute. No polite applause, no murmured conversations. The weight of history and truth had descended upon the room, making such social niceties seem hollow. Richard's face had lost its usual color. The familiar mask of confidence and control had cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. He looked around at his gathered friends and associates, seeing for perhaps the first time how their usual displays of wealth and power appeared in this new light. Several guests began to move toward the exits, as if unable to bear the tension any longer. Others remained rooted in place, caught between social obligation and moral discomfort. The carefully orchestrated party had become something else entirely, a moment of forced reflection that none of them had expected or wanted. Sarah watched it all unfold, recognizing that this moment might represent a genuine opportunity for change. The raw power of Lila's performance had accomplished what years of careful advocacy and polite suggestions had failed to do. It had made the invisible visible, the ignored undeniable. The grand ballroom, with its imported marble and priceless art, no longer seemed like a showcase of wealth and taste. Instead, it felt like a courtroom where something profound and long overdue had just been tried and judged. The verdict was written on every face, in every shifted glance and uncomfortable shuffle. Lila stepped down from the makeshift stage with quiet dignity. She didn't flee or hide, but moved with deliberate grace through the crowd. People parted before her, no longer seeing a servant, but something else entirely, a bearer of truth, a voice of reckoning. Richard stood frozen, the glass in his hand forgotten. The performance had stripped away his carefully constructed facade, leaving him exposed in a way that all his wealth and power couldn't shield him from. In his eyes, there was the beginning of something that looked like recognition, and perhaps, though it was too early to be sure, the first glimmer of change. The grand ballroom slowly emptied as STS made their excuses and departed, many leaving earlier than usual for a Lawson party. Their hasty exits carried the unmistakable air of retreat, of people desperate to escape the uncomfortable truth that had been laid bare before them. The clicking of expensive heels on marble and the soft shutting of car doors outside created a steady rhythm of departure. Lila stood in a quiet corner near the kitchen entrance, her work uniform now feeling like armor rather than a mark of servitude. Several guests had approached her on their way out, attempting to compliment her performance, but their words came out awkward and strained, heavy with the weight of newly awakened consciousness. Richard remained rooted in place, his usual commanding presence diminished. The half-empty Scotch glass in his hand had grown warm, forgotten in the wake of what had transpired. His eyes kept moving between Lila and the space where she had performed, as if trying to reconcile the servant he thought he knew with the powerful presence she had revealed herself to be. Sarah watched the scene unfold, maintaining her position nearby, but giving Richard space to process what had happened. She recognized the signs of internal struggle in his face, the slight furrow of his brow, the occasional clench of his jaw, the way his eyes couldn't quite settle on any one thing for too long. After what seemed like an eternity of charged silence, Richard moved. His steps toward Lila were hesitant, lacking his usual confident stride. The remaining guests watched with barely concealed interest, like audience members holding their breath during the climax of a play. "Lila," he began, his voice unusually quiet. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Lila." The words seemed to stick in his throat, unfamiliar territory for a man accustomed to giving orders rather than apologies. Lila turned to face him fully, her expression composed but not submissive. The pendant at her neck caught the light, seeming to pulse with the same strength she had shown during her performance. She waited, letting him struggle with the moment. "I should not have." Richard paused again, looking down at his glass before setting it aside on a nearby table. "What I did was wrong, forcing you to perform, treating you like—" He trailed off, the words entertainment or property hanging unspoken in the air. The few remaining guests had stopped pretending not to listen, their conversations falling silent as they watched this unprecedented scene unfold. Richard Lawson, apologizing to a member of his household staff. It was something none of them had ever expected to witness. "Your song," Richard continued, finding his footing somewhat. "It reminded me of things my grandmother used to tell me, things I chose to forget or ignore. Stories about our family's past, about responsibilities I've been avoiding." Sarah moved closer now, her presence offering silent support to both parties. She could see the genuine struggle in Richard's face, the first real crack in his armor of privilege that she'd witnessed in all their years of friendship. Lila's response, when it came, was measured and clear. "The songs I sang tonight were not just music, Mr. Lawson. They're the history of my people, passed down through generations. My grandmother taught them to me, just as her grandmother taught her." She touched her pendant gently. "They carry truth that can't be buried under wealth or privilege." The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably at her words, perhaps hearing in them echoes of their own buried histories and ignored responsibilities. A few more made their way to the exit, leaving only a handful of witnesses to this transformative moment. "I would like to understand more," Richard said finally, the words seeming to cost him something. "About the songs, about your grandmother, about what these stories mean." He gestured vaguely at the room around them. "All of this, it suddenly feels hollow and recent." A slight smile touched Lila's lips, not one of triumph, but of cautious hope. "Understanding requires listening, Mr. Lawson. Real listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak. Are you prepared for that?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance beyond the immediate moment. Richard's response would determine not just the course of the evening, but potentially the direction of significant change in their intertwined lives. The last few guests had finally departed, leaving only Richard, Lila, and Sarah in the vast ballroom. The catering staff moved silently through the space, clearing glasses and plates, but keeping their distance from the intense conversation unfolding in the center of the room. "My grandmother's name was Margaret Rose," Lila began, her voice steady. "But before that, it was Margaret Rose Jenkins. She changed it after leaving Georgia in 1963. She watched Richard's face carefully as she spoke, noting how he stiffened at the mention of the name Jenkins. Richard's complexion paled visibly. "Jenkins," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "From the Jenkins cotton plantation?" His hand reached out to steady himself against a nearby chair, the weight of recognition settling heavily on his shoulders. "The same," Lila confirmed. "Your great-grandfather, Theodore Lawson, bought that plantation in 1945. But the Jenkins family, my family, had worked that land for generations before that. Not as employees, Mr. Lawson. As property." Sarah stood quietly, witnessing the unfolding of a history she hadn't known about, despite her years of friendship with Richard. The empty ballroom seemed to hold its breath, the crystal chandeliers casting shadows that danced like ghosts of the past across their faces. "My grandmother told me stories," Richard said slowly, memories surfacing that he'd long suppressed. "About the plantation, about the families that stayed on after the sale. She always seemed troubled when she spoke about it. Now I understand why." Lila reached beneath her collar and pulled out the pendant, letting it catch the light. "This belonged to my great-grandmother. She kept it hidden in her apron pocket during the day, only taking it out at night when she sang to her children. Songs of hope, of freedom, of a future she couldn't see but believed in." Richard's eyes fixed on the pendant, recognition flickering across his face. "There was a photograph in my grandmother's study, a woman wearing that exact pendant. She used to point to it and try to tell me something, but I was always too busy, too focused on building my fortune to listen." "That woman was my great-grandmother," Lila said. "Your grandmother tried to make things right, in her own way. She set up a trust for the Jenkins children's education, but your grandfather dissolved it after she died. The money disappeared into the family holdings, your holdings, Mr. Lawson." The weight of this revelation seemed to physically press Richard down. He sank into the chair he'd been leaning against, his usual commanding presence crumbling under the weight of historical truth. "I had no idea. All these years building on that fortune, never questioning where it came from. The money that built this mansion," Lila continued, her voice gaining strength, "that funded your first business ventures, that pays my salary now. It grew from the labor of my ancestors. The same ancestors who sang these songs while working fields they didn't own, raising children they couldn't protect." Sarah moved closer, placing a steadying hand on Richard's shoulder. "History doesn't stay buried forever, Richard. Sometimes it finds ways to surface, to demand acknowledgement. When I hired you," Richard looked up at Lila, his voice rough with emotion, "did you know about our family's connection?" "I knew," Lila nodded. "My grandmother made sure we all knew our history, not to foster hatred, but to understand where we came from, what we survived. When I saw your name on the job listing, I chose to apply. I wanted to see what had become of the Lawson fortune, built on the backs of my people." The silence that followed was heavy with generations of unspoken truth. The catering staff had stopped their work, standing frozen at the edges of the room, witnesses to this unexpected confrontation with history. "The song you sang tonight," Richard said finally, "about rivers and freedom. It wasn't just any spiritual, was it?" "No," Lila replied softly. "It was composed by my great-grandmother, on the plantation your family bought. The same plantation where she died, never seeing the freedom she sang about. But her children saw it, and their children after them. We carry their songs, their stories, their strength." Richard stood slowly, decades of privilege and presumption visibly falling away from his shoulders. The man who remained seemed smaller somehow, but perhaps more real than he'd ever been in his life. The remaining catering staff had gathered near the kitchen entrance, drawn by the intensity of the unfolding scene. Richard noticed them, and for the first time in his life, really saw them, not as servants but as people with their own histories, their own stories that might parallel Lila's. "Everyone," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "please join us. This concerns all of you too." He gestured for them to come closer, breaking decades of invisible barriers between employer and staff. The workers exchanged uncertain glances before slowly moving forward. Among them was James, the elderly groundskeeper who had worked for the Lawsons for 30 years, and Maria, the housekeeper who had first told Richard about Lila's singing. They gathered in a loose semicircle, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly interested in what was happening. "Your grandmother's trust," Richard said, turning back to Lila. The one my grandfather dissolved. Do you have any records of it? Documents, letters, anything? Sarah stepped forward. The Foundation might be able to help with that research. We have historians who specialize in tracking down documentation of historical injustices. She paused, looking thoughtfully at Richard. But I sense you're thinking of something more immediate. Richard nodded, running a hand through his hair. A gesture that made him look more human than the polished billionaire persona he usually projected. The trust needs to be reinstated with interest. But that's just the beginning. He looked around at his assembled staff. How many of you have similar stories? Histories that connect to wealthy families like mine? Several hands raised hesitantly. James, the groundskeeper, cleared his throat. My grandfather worked for the Petersons before they lost everything in the crash of '29. Never saw a dime of his last 3 years' wages. Maria stepped forward. My mother was a maid for the Whitakers. Worked 60 years in their house, raised their children. When she got sick, they let her go without pension or health care. Richard listened to each story with growing understanding. The magnificent ballroom, which had hosted countless parties celebrating wealth and status, now became a space for long-suppressed truths to emerge. We need to document all of this, Sarah said, her professional experience kicking in. These aren't just personal stories. They're part of a larger pattern that needs to be addressed systematically. Yes, Richard agreed, surprising everyone with the firmness of his response. And we'll start here with my own family's history. He turned to face his staff directly. I'm announcing now, full college scholarships for all your children and grandchildren. Retroactive healthcare coverage for retired workers. And that's just the beginning. A murmur ran through the gathered workers. Maria dabbed at her eyes with her apron, while James stood straighter, years of stored tension busy. Bly leaving his shoulders. Lila watched Richard carefully, measuring his sincerity. Actions matter more than promises, Mr. Lawson. Many white families have made grand gestures of restitution before, only to let them fade when the moment of conscience passes. You're right, Richard acknowledged, which is why I want to formalize this immediately. He turned to Sarah. Can your foundation help set up a proper trust? Something legally binding, with oversight and accountability? Sarah nodded, already pulling out her phone to make notes. We can have preliminary paperwork drawn up by morning. But Richard, this will mean going public with your family's history. Are you prepared for that? Richard looked around the ballroom, at the expensive artwork and antiques that suddenly seemed to carry the weight of their own complicated histories. The truth was always there, wasn't it? In every luxury item, every business deal, every party like this one. Maybe it's time for all of us to stop pretending. The staff members exchanged looks of cautious hope. Some had worked in wealthy homes for decades, carrying their own family histories of exploitation and loss, never expecting acknowledgement, let alone restitution. We'll need to organize properly, Sarah said, shifting into planning mode. Set up committees, establish criteria for claims, create transparent processes for distribution of funds. In education, Lila added firmly, not just college scholarships, but programs to teach these histories, to make sure they're not forgotten again. She touched her pendant. The songs and stories need to be preserved, documented, shared. Richard nodded, a new sense of purpose replacing his earlier shock and shame. Then let's begin now. Tonight. No more waiting. The night had grown late, but no one in the ballroom seemed aware of the time. The space that had hours earlier hosted a display of wealth and privilege had transformed into an impromptu war room for social change. The catering staff had brought out coffee and water, setting up an informal refreshment station on one of the ornate side tables. We should start with documentation, Sarah said, having taken charge of organizing the emerging plans. She commandeered one of the dining tables, her phone and notebook laid out before her. Each family story needs to be recorded properly. Dates, names, locations, everything that can be verified. Around the room, small groups had formed. Staff members who had worked together for years without knowing each other's histories now shared stories in low, intense conversations. Their words echoed off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, filling the space with long-suppressed truths. Richard moved between the groups, listening more than speaking, He stopped at each cluster, hearing stories about grandparents who had worked as sharecroppers, parents who had been domestic servants, families displaced by urban renewal projects that had enriched developers like himself. "The press will be all over this," he said to Sarah during a quiet moment. "Not just the local papers. This will make national news. Other families like mine, other corporations built on similar histories, they'll see this as a threat." "Good," Sarah replied firmly. "Let them feel threatened. Maybe it will make them examine their own histories." She looked up from her notes. "Are you prepared for the backlash? Your board members, your business partners, they won't all support this." Before Richard could respond, Lila approached with Maria and James. "We've been talking," she said, her voice carrying the authority she claimed during her performance. "This isn't just about financial restitution. We need to address the ongoing patterns of inequality in how household staff are treated, not just here, but throughout the wealthy communities." Maria nodded, finding courage in the night's revelations. "Many of us work in multiple homes in this neighborhood. The story. Yes, we could tell about how workers are treated, the discrimination, the exploitation. Then we'll address that too," Richard said, surprising himself with his own conviction. "We'll set standards, create a workers' rights charter. Any family that wants to maintain social connections with mine will need to comply." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Using social pressure for progressive change? Richard, you might be learning faster than I expected." The sound of heels on marble drew everyone's attention. A small group of party guests had returned. Those who had left earlier, but found themselves unable to simply go home and forget what they'd witnessed. "We heard you were still here," said Eleanor Preston, one of the city's most prominent philanthropists. "Some of us, well, we've been talking about our own family's histories, our own responsibilities." She glanced at the other returning guests, who nodded in agreement. "There's so much we've ignored," added Thomas Montgomery, a third-generation banking executive. "So many questions we never asked about where our family fortunes came from." The room grew quiet as more former guests filtered back in. The staff members watched warily, years of experience making them skeptical of sudden changes of heart among the wealthy. "If you're serious," Lila addressed the returning guests, "then be prepared for uncomfortable truths. Every family fortune has its shadows, its buried histories." Eleanor stepped forward. "Then help us uncover them. All of them. No more pretending, no more looking away." Richard moved to stand beside Lila, physically demonstrating his commitment to this new alignment. "We'll need to organize properly. Create a formal organization dedicated to researching these histories and implementing real changes." "The foundation can help with that," Sarah offered. "We have experience setting up similar initiatives in other cities." But she looked pointedly at the returned guests. "This will require more than just money. It will require real commitment to change." The night that had begun with a forced performance was evolving into something none of them could have predicted. A moment of collective awakening, of long-buried truths finally surfacing. "We should document this too," Lila said, touching her pendant. "Tonight's story, how it began, what it's becoming. Future generations need to know that change is possible, that truth can break through even the strongest barriers of privilege." Around the room, phones had come out, not for social media posts or party photos, but to record names, dates, contacts, the first steps toward concrete action. The air hummed with purpose, with the energy of people who had glimpsed a possibility they couldn't now unsee. As midnight approached, Lila stood once again before the assembled group, but this time by choice rather than command. Her pendant caught the chandelier light differently now, seeming to pulse with the weight of the revelation she was about to share. "There's something else you need to know, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice carrying the same strength it had during her performance, but now tinged with a different kind of purpose. "My grandmother, Margaret Rose Jenkins, she wasn't just any worker on your family's plantation." Richard leaned forward, sensing the significance in her tone. The remaining guests and staff members drew closer, forming an intimate circle in the vast ballroom that had witnessed so much that evening. "Your grandmother, Elizabeth Lawson," Lila continued, "wasn't just troubled by the plantation's history. She was trying to right a specific wrong. She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew an aged, crease photograph. This picture was taken in 1962, just before my grandmother left Georgia. Sarah moved closer to examine the photograph as Lila held it out. It showed two women, one black and one white, standing together in what appeared to be a garden. They were smiling, their store suggesting not the usual distance between employer and servant, but something closer to friendship. Your grandmother and mine were more than just employer and employee, Lila revealed, her voice steady. They were friends, real friends, in a time and place where such friendship was dangerous. Elizabeth Lawson was part of an underground network helping black families escape abusive situations on other plantations. Richard's face drained of color as pieces of his family history suddenly clicked into place. The trust fund, it wasn't just about guilt or charity, was it? No, Lila confirmed. It was about protecting the families who had helped others escape, who had risked everything to save lives. Your grandmother established that trust in secret, using her own inheritance. When your grandfather discovered it, he didn't just dissolve it, Richard finished, remembering family arguments he'd overheard as a child. He tried to erase all record of it, of the connection between our families. The returning guests listened in stunned silence. Eleanor Preston clutched her pearls, but this time not in disapproval, in recognition of the courage such actions would have required in that era. My grandmother was one of the most respected civil rights activists in Georgia, Lila said, pride evident in her voice. She worked in secret, using her position in your grandmother's household to help coordinate escape routes, safe houses, and new identities for families fleeing violence. Sarah's professional composure broke slightly. The Preston route, she whispered, naming a famous underground network that had helped hundreds of families reach safety. Your grandmother was part of that? She helped create it, Lila confirmed. And Elizabeth Lawson provided the funding, the connections, and the protection they needed to operate. They saved hundreds of lives together. Richard stood abruptly, moving to one of the large paintings that dominated the ballroom wall. With trembling hands, he lifted it away, revealing a wall safe. There were papers my grandmother left me, documents I never bothered to read. She made me promise to keep them safe, but the safe opened with a soft click. Inside lay a leather portfolio, its contents preserved for decades. As Richard withdrew it, a small note fell to the floor. Sarah picked it up, reading aloud. For when you're ready to understand. Love, Grandma Elizabeth. The documents inside told the full story. Detailed records of the underground network, correspondence between Elizabeth Lawson and Margaret Rose Jenkins, lists of families helped, and evidence of the trust fund's original purpose. Your grandmother wasn't just trying to make amends, Lila said softly. She was continuing their work, ensuring that future generations would have the resources to fight for justice. When your grandfather shut it down, she made sure the record survived, waiting for someone who would understand. Richard looked at Lila with new understanding. You didn't apply for this job by chance, did you? You knew these documents were here. My grandmother told me where to look, Lila acknowledged. She and Elizabeth had planned for this moment, planned for a time when the truth could finally come out. They knew it might take generations, but they believed that someday their work could continue openly. The ballroom fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over everyone present. The night that had begun with an act of humiliation had transformed into something none of them could have predicted, the unveiling of a legacy of courage, cooperation, and hope. Then we honor them both, Richard said finally, his voice firm with conviction. Not just with restitution or apologies, but by continuing their work, by bringing their vision of justice and equality into the present. The first light of dawn was beginning to seep through the ballroom windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. But in that moment, everyone present could feel the weight of history lifting, transforming into a blueprint for the future. Lila touched her pendant one last time, feeling the connections across generations, not just of oppression and pain, but of resistance, friendship, and the enduring hope for change. The song she had sung earlier echoed in memory, but now its meaning had expanded, encompassing not just the past, but the promise of what was yet to come.